Hello, everyone. It's Thursday, January 22nd. It's just over 1 p.m. here in Montreal, and I want to welcome you all to another episode of the PR Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Tan Sukhera, and for those who don't know me, I'm the CEO and co-founder of PR, a boutique learning company focused on translating frameworks and methodologies from mathematics, sciences, and philosophy into intellectual capital used by global chief communications officers. Their goal, of course, is to inform strategy and build trust in the C-suite. Today's discussion topic is on the skills and mindset needed to grow in communications. As we approach the end of January with state actors and business leaders concluding their summit in Davos, I feel it's a fitting time to have this discussion today because growth is becoming less of an option and more of a survival scenario as the rising tides of proficiency seem to be forcing communications leaders, and indeed those in power, to rethink their beliefs and challenge their own biases for fear of being left behind. Today, I'm joined by a guest whose LinkedIn posts I frequently enjoy. He often weighs in on matters concerning both corporate and internal communications, and I especially appreciate his perspective because I just love it when people are no nonsense when it comes to breaking the cycle of, hey, but we've always done it this way. I'm speaking about Keith Berman. Keith Berman's career has centered around audience engagement. After spending a decade honing his storytelling skills as a journalist and working for a marketing agency, Keith got into corporate communications with a particular focus on internal and executive communications. He's worked at companies as small as a 20-person startup to a 250,000-person Fortune 10 business, covering many different industries, including telecommunications, entertainment, B2B SaaS, healthcare, industrial, food and beverage, medtech, and insurance. Keith, it is great to have you.
Thanks, Dan. Good to be here. And yes, I wouldn't even say I'm no nonsense. It's more like I say what's on my mind. And unfortunately, sometimes the filter just magically goes poof. And I make some weird comments on LinkedIn that people seem to agree with.
Hey, it's fortunate for us communicators. And that's a good segue here because, look, we're at the backdrop of what some analysts call a consolidation of power by CEOs, with studies showing they're perceiving themselves as the main communications function of their business. But now we in communications know that when done right, we have a proven track record to surface insights, important insights, which the business can then turn around and operationalize to achieve their goals. What's your no-nonsense view, your point of view on this, Keith?
So I have an analogy that I've brought out every now and then, especially as pertaining to internal communications. I liken it to the central nervous system of a business. You have the executive team that formulates the strategy. That's the brain. And obviously, the brain wants the arms, hands, legs, and feet to do certain things, to move in certain ways, to accomplish certain things. Like the brain is like, I want to go to the fridge and get something to eat. How do we accomplish that? Well, the brain sends the appropriate signals to push back my chair, and my legs boost me up and get me to the fridge, and then my arm opens the fridge, my hands grasp the handle and open it. The central nervous system really takes all those signals from the brain, carries them through the system, and operationalizes them, translates them to the legs, the feet, the hands, the arms, to be able to say, in order to accomplish this, this is what you specifically have to do. And so I think that's an important piece because you have a lot of leaders who are speaking at very high levels where strategy is concerned. And that may not translate all the way down. When someone talks about, we're going to synergize and align and all the other buzzwords that come out, like, to your average frontline employee or even frontline managers or sometimes even middle managers, middle employees, that may not always translate to, okay, how am I going to be able to contribute to that? How do I ladder up to that? And that's where the internal comms team really comes into play. The other portion of that, though, is the central nervous system is bidirectional. And I think an internal comms team also needs to be bidirectional and has to have the security and the safety to be able to speak truth to power back to the brain. So if you accidentally put your hand on a hot oven burner and you pull back and you say, ow, well, that's the central nervous system sending the signal from the hand back up through the chain saying this was dangerous, this was hot, it hit pain receptors. And so, because comms people are typically very plugged in across an entire company, across many different organizations within that company, it's important for us to be able to carry that signal back and be able to say, okay, well, this segment over here, they're not doing so well with this. We either need to change what we're doing or reformulate how we say it, or maybe change some of the strategy pertaining to that particular piece of the organization. And it's the same thing with external as well, because external comms keeps an eye on the market, how things are being responded to, brand awareness, how consumers, if it's a B2B or B2C, because obviously you can have customers that are both fellow businesses and as well as regular consumer people like me who go to stores every day and buy stuff every day. How are we talking about this? How is our business coming off in the media? If we're publicly traded, is our stock price tanking? So I think the communications really does need to be able to translate things from the brain out to any particular audience to make it actionable, to make it understandable, and then also be able to carry that pain back and also carry the good things back, like, "Oh, I'm touching this velour jumpsuit and it feels very nice. So let's keep doing that because I like velour and it feels very wonderful." So that's kind of how I see communications being networked across an organization. And I think that last piece is very important because too many people who don't understand what comms does, too many people can just see communications as the mechanism. Send the email, post something on the intranet. And it's not just that. We do so much in terms of strategy and translation and the back and forth. And for me personally, I have an undergraduate degree in psychology. It's actually helped me an awful lot in my career because part of comms is you got to know how people are going to think. When they hear or see or read something, they're going to respond in some way. And you need to be able to make sure that message lands, and you need to be able to decipher how they're responding to it and what emotional connection they're making to the content. Because at the end of the day, people take action based on emotional response. We're not entirely logical creatures as much as we would like to think that we are. And emotion is what drives action. And that's what communications people, if they're really good at their jobs, they will create the emotional connection to drive a desired action, bottom line.
I'm curious about the psychology side because I agree. I think that's a superpower, especially in communications. I'm seeing that there's so much, even if you look at neuropsychology, behavioral sciences, looking at biases, looking at the way that people think, breaking those, let's say, misconceptions down, assumptions that people have. There's so many different biases that show themselves every day in the work that communicators do, right? Like from an authority bias to confirmation bias, some that are systemic, actually. There's some that are unconscious, obviously. And so I wonder, just out of curiosity, the psychological side of things, you said it's something you do draw upon, right?
Mhm.
I wonder how does that benefit you as a communicator, like having that psychological understanding where maybe others don't?
I would say that it helps in that, again, going back to the emotional response, it helps people like me anticipate how things will land. There's certain ways that people say things that they may not realize that can be more emotionally charged, and ways that things can possibly be said in a different way that will help with the outcome. I'll give you an example. Something happened at work and someone sent an email where they didn't get the desired outcome of something, and the email said from pretty high up in the chain of leadership, "Where's the miss?" And it was like, I mean, I got this email and it was like, okay, well, this person's coming in hot. And rationally, I knew I need to project executive presence, but still emotionally inside, it was churning a little bit because I'm thinking, okay, well, this person's coming at me a little bit and it's not really my fault. I'm going to rationally and calmly explain the situation, why things happened the way it was. But I think when you have a good understanding for how people will receive certain things, and it's not, and this is a tenet that I've tried to keep through my communications career. It's not about how I want to deliver the message, it's how I want my audience to receive it. So I need to make sure that psychologically I'm delivering it in a way that will be well received, pleasantly received if needed, motivational, etc., all the things that I need for the desired outcome from an emotional standpoint. And so knowing what kind of triggers through language, through body language, through delivery style, that really helps. Either I can avoid the landmines or I can use a proven approach that will engender trust. I personally, one of the things that I do is humor comes somewhat easily to me. So I find that a well placed joke and a well placed reference really helps smooth over relationships very easily and very early on and very quickly. And so I feel like one of my own personal superpowers with the psychology of it is I can network pretty well and I can build trust very quickly because I come off as an affable, likable, average dude. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there in the corner going, "Ooh, I will now conquer the world," and pet my invisible bald cat like Dr. Evil. But it's something that I don't want to say emotional manipulation because that makes it sound horrible, but in some ways it kind of is. But again, using powers for good in order to make sure that the audience is taking in those messages in a way that will properly motivate them towards an outcome that is good for them. I mean, look, humans by nature do not like change either. So a big portion of change management is psychology in terms of you've got to be able to convince them that what you are doing, what you're changing is good for them. It will be better for them in the long run. Yes, there might be some short-term uncomfortability or pain or whatever, but in the end, this is actually going to be a pretty good thing. But if you just come at somebody and be like, we're changing our process, now do this, they're going to put up their defenses and it's going to be even harder for you to convince them to take the path that you want to take. One other note is that you mentioned unconscious bias. I will say this is something that I've been able to leverage AI a little bit for, where I've been able to uncover a couple of my own unconscious biases where it was funny. We were putting into place a policy that I didn't quite agree with, and we were going to do a survey on it for our employees. So I ran it through AI to say, okay, well, here's the survey questions that I wrote. Here are my feelings on it. Can you make sure that I'm presenting this in a way that is unbiased, even keeled, and neutral so that I'm not letting my own personal biases show through in the way this survey was designed? And chat came back to me. It's like, yeah, there's a few questions that seem a little bit, tilted. So let's try and reword them. So I would think that being able to have those tools at your disposal to help communicators cover some of the areas that they may have a blind spot for, it's paying off in some ways.
Massively. I fully agree. And I'm so glad to hear that because I think it's something I encourage communications leaders to do more often is use your co-pilot. Ask about the biases that you might be, missing, maybe some sort of blind spots or gaps that you might be missing. And it could be pretty eye-opening. Just reading between the lines of some of the things that you said, anticipation was something that you kind of highlighted was a major effect of having this sort of mindset and skill set. But I also could read between the lines and see self-regulation, that emotional intelligence aspect, and that sort of, the introspective view that you get through the that self-regulation gives you the maturity to become the effective communicator the CEO is relying upon, and
You're calling
not
me mature? No, 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 no. No,
well.
sorry, that's not a thing. No.
For the listeners, when we last met up, Keith and I spoke about the power of the mindset for communications leaders, the kind that fosters true communications leadership and high performance. And Keith brought up a neat story from Star Trek, and I just loved how simple and obvious it was. But would you share that again for us?
So I'm pretty blatant about the fact that I am a massive Star Trek nerd. And yes, I firmly believe that there is a bright line between sci-fi and fantasy. And even though pop culture, like, in all the bookstores and all the other, and the movie places they like to lump sci-fi and fantasy together. It's not. Sci-fi is like Star Trek and transporters and warp drive, and fantasy is Star Wars and dragons and all that, and I'm not into the fantasy side of things. Very much the Star Trek side of things. So, Trek fans, bring it. I'm happy to debate and do trivia with you. Star Wars fans, sorry. So the story I brought up was from one of the movies from the original series, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. For people who haven't seen it, very quick summary of the scene. Khan is Admiral Kirk's nemesis. He's been away for 15 years, exiled to a planet, manages to commandeer a Federation starship and go after the Enterprise. And because it's another Federation starship, Admiral Kirk is like, yeah, they're cool. We're fine, as Khan's ship comes up on him. And then all of a sudden, Khan's ship locks weapons and blows the hell out of the Enterprise, and they're crippled. And, Khan is demanding unconditional surrender, and he's going to basically, destroy the Enterprise. And Kirk pulls this maneuver where he asks for something called a prefix code. And it's a simple combination key code that allows Enterprise to access the other starship's console and basically order them to lower their shields by sending the command from Enterprise's weapons console. Kirk asks the lieutenant cadet on the station, pull up the prefix code. And she said, oh, but this, by the way, was Kirstie Alley's first ever role. Like in the credits of the movie, it says introducing Kirstie Alley. And she responds, the prefix code. And Kirk says this really simple line, and it just resonated with me. And, 40 some odd years later, you can see that it's still resonating with me. He goes, Lieutenant, you have to know why things work on a starship, not just how. And that hits me in the way of just having the tool is not as powerful as knowing when to deploy it and how to deploy it. And I feel like there's a lot of tools that communicators have in their toolbox, and it's not about showing off that you have the tool. It's about knowing why things work a certain way and why this tool is perhaps the best one to use in that particular moment. Especially as part of executive presence, there's a certain reason why you would do something and react a certain way, even though it might make you recoil inside, or, you've got the inner anger guy getting ready to blast fire through the top of his head or whatever. It is something where you have to figure out, why does this work on the starship? Why do we have this? Not just, do we have this? And so, like, one thing that might apply even more simply in a communications perspective is people will be like, I want to send an email. I want to send it to the entire company. Okay, that's the how. Why do you want to do that? Is that the best way to get this message out? Are you spreading your net too wide? Will this matter to everyone, or will it have the unintended consequence of hammering people's inboxes, and then they become desensitized to the messages that you really want to cut through? Because I call this, not to get political about it, I call it Fox News syndrome, because they had a system where, like, especially with older TVs that were on Fox News all day long, they had the breaking news chyron up on the screen in the same place all the time, to the point where when you could actually get screen burn, you would turn off the TV and you would still be able to see the chyron that says breaking news because it had been burned into the little panels there. So my point there is, when everything is breaking news, nothing is. You need to be able to pull the right levers when and how it's best needed, versus just pull the lever. This will work. How? Yes. No. It's not always going to have the intended effect.
And I fully agree with this. And also, there's a term that we use for it in my work with CCOs. It's called second order effects. And the idea being, those unintended consequences, or maybe intended, depending on how far ahead of it you can get, that you got to tick that box and say, am I aware of the potential second order effects of this action that I'm planning to take? Because without doing so, the risk profile of the action is increased. And sometimes the risk of the immediate effect is far less than that of the second order effects. And I think that's basically what we're talking about here. Having the entire organization desensitized to your to the messaging that you really do want to be able to share is far worse than not maybe having an open rate that you're not happy with, for example.
Yeah. And it's funny you mention that because one of the other pop culture references that I frequently keep in my back pocket as far as comm strategy, and also not just comm strategy, but being a strategic advisor to the business, is from the movie Dude, Where's My Car? Again, calling me mature is definitely not in the cards for me. Um, so there's a scene in the or actually I think a couple scenes in the movie where they go to this Chinese food fast food drive-through, and they have, the ordering thing that they speak through. And the joke is the person on the other end of the ordering thing in the booth just keeps saying, "And then," and it's like it gets down to the point where Ashton Kutcher's like, "And then I'm gonna take it home. And then I'm gonna enjoy it because it's delicious and I'm hungry. And then," so for me, that second order effect, like, I tend to think of it in terms of "and then," like, if you do something, and then what's gonna happen? And then what's gonna happen? And you tend to map out all these different action paths of what could happen. And I feel like comms people, because we do have that strategic mindset as leaders, we are able to see the and thens a lot better because we are so connected, and we tend to, just by osmosis and just by the connections of being spread across an entire company and plugged in with so many different parts of the company, we tend to see the impacts before they happen, and we can help advise against them. And we can be the ones in the meeting that's raise our hands and say, "Okay, so if this, then that, and then if that, then this other thing, and we don't want to go down this path. So can we perhaps try something else, or try, a different approach to this, or maybe scrap this idea altogether because it's probably going to backfire on us a little bit? Or, we could have so much success that this is going to cause this problem. Are we prepared for this event?" Like yesterday, I was in a meeting where they were talking about setting goals for how much customer growth we were going to have in a certain period of time. And I raised my hand as the comms person. I raised my hand. I said, "Okay, so it took us almost a year to get to a mark that's right here. And you're talking about in the next 5, 6 months going 6x on that. Do we have the support structure in place to be able to bring all these new customers on and get them onboarded?" I get that, the first period of time was the proving grounds, and we've got some of the bugs ironed out still, but do we still have the support and the people power in place to be able to manage this? And they're like, "Yeah, maybe not." Is that my place to say as a comms person? Probably not, because I'm not involved in those departments. Is it my place as a strategic business advisor and someone who wants to see the best positive outcome of whatever happens for the business? So, and to some extent in self-preservation, not have to send out messages later on apologizing for the chaos and trying to fix it. But, is it my job as that strategic business advisor to raise my hand and say, "Can we actually do this?" Sure. I'm contributing to the conversation. But back to your point about EQ, it's about positioning it in the right way so that you're not challenging, and you're not coming off as a subject matter expert in something that is not your area of expertise. It's more like, "Hey, I had a question, like, thinking about this, can we actually do this?" And coming off as being thoughtful more than anything. So, and
You
then,
And then, this thing that you're talking about, I think is firstly a great reference because it's memorable and it's entertaining. And you're touching on a very important note here. This if then, the and then, right? It's the backbone of every strategy. In our field, sometimes we look at it with another word called counterfactual reasoning. And so, with counterfactual reasoning, the conversation becomes about listing out those potential and thens, and then using different reasoning techniques to eliminate those which would not be possible through some scrutiny. And
mm,
as you whittle them down, you end up with a much more constrained and probabilistic set of outcomes similar to the spaghetti plot that you see with the weatherman stand in front of, where they say this hurricane is going either this direction in the blue line, or it could go green, which is just this direction here, or red, but it's not going to go 360 degrees. It could just go any which way to Sunday. It's been mathematically and through deductive reasoning broken down. And I think that when it gets really interesting, especially in the communications conversation and marketing communications, I'd include here, is the investment conversation. You end up with and then what happens when we increase this investment? And then what happens if we decrease this investment? What happens to our, think of it like a GPS. What happens to our time of arrival?
Mm.
Does it increase or decrease? And so I think that conversation that you were having with the organization about the time of arrival and reaching the goal within the next 6 months, within the next year, is it realistic? This is a very critical conversation, and I hope that the listeners that are in communications who are in these type of scenarios can take a page out of the book and try and follow in that footsteps with, especially with a strong reasoning hat. And I think that's a good, Keith, way to come back to the mindset conversation. And as you know, it's something that I speak about often with the CCOs, but I call it a growth mindset. It's just the willingness to learn, to just be vulnerable just enough to know when you're wrong. And it's a sort of intellectual humility. And it's not that common, frankly. And I feel it's a muscle you could train. But I'm curious, what do you think are some of those skills that leaders need to have, not just nice to have skills, but the ones that you'd need to have in order to really grow in terms of career pathways in communications, like breaking glass ceilings as a communications leader, reaching that point where maybe you feel maybe you can't go beyond, but maybe the skills will help you achieve that next level. What's your point of view on this?
I definitely fall back on EQ an awful lot. There's that saying that one of the greatest superpowers is being easy to work with. It's there's an expression, and I'm gonna botch it, I think like the arrogant genius or something like that, where people will appreciate having your knowledge on the team, but the way that you express it, if you come off as an arrogant know-it-all, they're gonna be like, "Okay, well, we've got to invite Keith to the meeting, and he's gonna go off on somebody because they made some stupid remark." You don't wanna be that person who is grudgingly included in the meeting. You wanna be the person who they're like, "Oh, yeah, we have to have him there, or her there, or them there, or whatever." You wanna be the person who's seen as curious, like you said, wants to learn, but has the humility, as you said, also to be able to understand what they don't know that they know enough to be dangerous and ask questions, but also, again, it's positioning. I can go into any room and be like, I could go into any room and probably know the answer, but I might couch it as, this might be a dumb question, but what about this? Because I don't want to come off as the know it all. I don't want to come off as the person who colors way outside of my lines as a subject matter expert in somebody else's field, because I shouldn't be. I was brought in as the subject matter expert in comms. And the fact that I have all these other tools at my disposal, yes, I can pull them in as needed, but being good to work with, being thoughtful, being curious enough, and I think down to earth and approachable enough that people will know I can openly say, I'm going to ask a dumb question. And if somebody says, yeah, that was a dumb question, I'm not going to be like, well, I hate them now for the rest of eternity. They know that there is easy trust there. And I will say that trust is actually something I've often said. Trust is one of the most difficult currencies, but most important currencies in business. It is so incredibly hard to earn, but so easy to spend out in an instant. But having a trust bank, and as one of my former mentors used to talk about, like making sure you're building up the trust bank so that when you need something or when you do have that mistake, you have that bank account to pull on. That's super important. I think that being the person who is sought out for advice is typically a good indicator of that trust metric, where you are being brought into meetings and included up front because people want your opinion, they want your questions. And so it's not about being the smartest person in the room, it's about having the purview and having the audacity to ask the questions, but the grace to ask them in the right way. That's a good measure of your EQ and being able to gauge how you're doing in that respect.
Hey, and I'm also reading between the lines here of what you're saying, Keith, and the ability to ask questions is clearly a major skill set to be able to master, especially in 2026 for communications leaders. And I think there might be, there's a bit of a sneaky suspicion, a few people who fancy themselves as great at asking questions when they, in fact, may be awful at it, frankly speaking, and maybe they're conflating the idea of having the confidence to ask a question as opposed to the question itself. And sometimes I find that the best questions, the ability to ask the best questions, that's really a secret to success in the world of business leadership, in the world of management consulting, in the world of communications and public relations and advertising. Like you'd be hard pressed to find a thinking profession that wouldn't benefit from this. And some of the things that happen when you want to be able to take, improve, let's say, your value of the questions is it's often something like getting outside of the implied framing,
Yeah, making sure that you're not leading the witness. Because if you
right?
do that, it's obvious you know where you're going and you're trying to trap them. Like you want to lead them straight into that bear trap so that they answer the question and you get proven right and look at how smart you are. And it's
Exactly.
it's totally not like that. It's coming from a genuine place of curiosity and coming from a genuine place of framing the question the right way, that it's open-ended enough that you're not leading the witness, that you're not telling them and signaling blatantly, "Yeah, I know what I'm talking about, and I'm just asking it this way to make it seem like I'm, letting you answer for me."
Right.
If you keep it open-ended enough, if you keep it, you know, innocent enough, I guess, and you ask the question without that bite of, "I know what I'm talking about, I just wanna hear you prove it for me," then I think that's the best way to be able to ask those questions.
Yeah, and like for example, you brought up a great story about a team discussion about targets and planning ahead, as one does at the top of the year, and the question being like, "Well, can we hit our targets, guys?" And then you put up your hand. Maybe a better question would be something along the lines of like, "What are some of the limiting factors that could hold us back from achieving our targets?" And that way we could list them out and begin to eliminate them or mitigate some of those risks. Perhaps that sort of subtle change in language, obviously, like you would know already, as a communicator, is that sort of powerful change. And I think sometimes it's almost like sometimes people are able to give really good advice, but they're not that great at following their own advice. It's like a psychological effect, that happens. It's almost like that is like the communicator is really good at curating the right words that fit the brand and the stakeholder and the perception of how they anticipating how they would be received. But then how they conduct themselves internally is an entirely different matter often. And that could be this to answer the question of the career pathways. Perhaps that is one of the major skills that could break some glass ceilings for communications leaders and get galvanized and not to get too jargony here, but really create more impact.
Yeah, and I also think it's not just eliminating the risk factors to allow you to proceed forward towards the proposed goal, because going back to the example that I gave, in my head, I'm thinking, like, are we actually going to be able to hit this? And so I think overall, it's about mitigating risk, period. Whether that's mitigating the risk of the potential hurdles that you will need to overcome in order to hit that goal, or is the goal actually attainable? Especially for an external comms organization where you publish a lot of things and everything is out in the public domain. If you don't hit a target, people can come back to you, and it's a real gotcha moment where if you publish goals, and especially if your CEO says it on Squawk Box or some other public forum, And then you come back in a year and the CEO is getting grilled again on live TV nationally or even internationally. And they're saying, well, you said a year ago you were going to be able to do this. Well, we had to walk that back. It's about mitigating the risk to be able to best achieve chances of success, whether that is internal hurdles that need to be overcome or external expectation management. You're still trying to mitigate risk. And I feel like communicators do not get enough credit for the amount of risk mitigation and, quite frankly, arson aversion, I would say,
Yeah.
that we actually do.
Aversion.
Yeah. Well, crisis aversion, yeah, and I often say that comms is harder than other avenues and other disciplines to measure because I can't prove a negative. I can't prove that things went right because of the communications that I sent out or the talking points that I gave to somebody or, how it got to the person, whether it was directly from the communication or they got it from a manager or they heard it from a coworker or something like that. It's very hard for me to be able to monetize things going right versus having to recover from a massive scandal or a mistake or operational collapse or whatever in a certain process. So in that way, communications cannot be tied to financial metrics of, oh, we have, this many MQLs or this many conversions or whatever. It makes it harder for us to exist as a strategic organization because, quite honestly, I say it's pretty mushy as far as what comms does sometimes. So, one of the things that I think we constantly have to fight against is this mentality that comms is a cost center for a business. We're a cost protector. We prevent businesses from incurring costs because people do things right. There's a great there's a great chart, pretty sure it's from Axios HQ, where they talk about the loss of efficiency due to bad communications and how much time people spend looking for information to do their jobs correctly or, to get something right. And it goes up exponentially, obviously, as the person is looking for information and they make more money, like meaning if a VP spends 10 minutes looking for information versus, a senior specialist spends 10 minutes looking for information, it's going to cost the company more when the VP does it. Having a clear path to information and having them be able to get it quickly and understand quickly, you save them 10 minutes of however much it costs the business to pay this person. I can't prove that we save that money every single day, 10 minutes per hour, all that. I will use that as a metric to justify my existence and my salary. But I can't specifically say 110% that's the money that I'm making the company. But it's a good metric, and it's kind of one of the only metrics that we can show as far as cost prevention and cost savings. Whereas marketing can go out there and say, yeah, we did this many conversions. Sales can say we made this many sales. This is how much we made the company. That's, I think, one of the biggest hurdles for a communications team to overcome is justifying our existence through finance.
Keith, I think maybe that's something we should definitely talk about offline as well, just between us. There's some resources I could share with you. You'd be really surprised to see what happens with this stuff. I have a measurement background, but I think it's definitely a challenge that a lot of communicators are facing. Maybe the majority of communicators are facing, but there are some psychological problems that we encounter in measurement as well. For example, concerning the fear of confronting the truth of performance. And we find that that is something that's a major limiting factor, which is leading to a type of head in the sand ostrich effect, where the communications leader actually doesn't want to know the truth about this measurement thing because it turns out it's incriminating. And as what's scary about it, is that what happens to this technology? So this technology is widely adopted right now in the Fortune 100, and these methodologies, and some of it I actually do work with CCOs on. This is causal inference, and it's about cause and effect in the end of the day,
Mm,
right? The
yeah.
reasoning around it. But what's really scary is what happens when the CEO and the CFO are aware of this technology reasoning methodologies, assessment techniques, let's call them advanced assessment techniques. Okay. And meanwhile, reluctantly, the CMO, the CCO, the VP comms, they're sort of aloof to these realities. What ends up happening is a type of leapfrogging effect, where whether you like it or not, there's this all-seeing eye of performance measurement and looking into the counterfactuals of the and then looking forward, talking about investments and these sort of things. What ends up happening is an immense amount of pressure on the comms and even though I'd say the entire growth function of a business. If it's the entire GTM, I include comms inside of that, and this is something that's really fascinating. But you make a good point as well. It's sort of an art and a science, right? And
Yeah.
so uh, being a trusted advisor, there's an art to it, isn't there? Of being a person who can uh, remove a risk. And I love to talk about this concept of sword and shield. And sometimes it's just shield, and sometimes it's a sword. And sometimes people think of I use example patents. Sometimes people think of a patent as a shield, but actually, if you're looking into the way that it works legally and go through the legalese of it and translate that, it's a sword because the way
Hmm.
that it works is you have to sue people who infringe upon it. But the connotation is being implied as if it's a shield and so on and so forth. There's some very interesting stuff there. Insurance. A lot of times the people they're like, "Well, I don't want to have the problem to begin with that I needed the insurance for," right? And so, what would be really interesting is to look and see how do you translate IC efforts to a sword and calculate that, and help an organization be more competitive than the now we're getting into some really interesting territory. We'll talk about that another day because I want to quickly get to AI before we end off here because I think you're really well positioned to give the audience a point of view on this, especially because you just tell it like it is, right? So I want to address this. What seems to be an elephant in the room for a lot of IC folks is, you know, we're living in a world where execution is being taken over much by artificial intelligence. It's a sort of like a tsunami wave. We can see it out in the distance, but there's these sort of swift rates of improvements. AI seems to be able to craft messaging and ideate and model scenarios and more. You were talking about finding these hidden biases, which I think again, very very good thing that if I were a doctor, I'd prescribe it. So the idea is like because it can do all these things, it places an emphasis on the skills and abilities of the true leaders. And I'd love to hear your take on the importance of the skills, like building the business acumen. Like maybe there's a skill that's understanding the business and how the sausage is made. Is that now becoming vital, crucial, critical? Or is it something is it aligned with CEO expectations or is it over and above the Call of Duty? Is it something that's like, look, we recommend you should probably learn about the way business works and how our business works, the external forces that are affecting our business, the foresight kind of thing. Are these things critical today or is it more of the same, let's say, than you would have seen, let's say, in 2023 or 22, et cetera?
So I think there's two questions there. One is about AI specifically, where AI stands right now. You talked about the art versus the science, and I do agree it is very much a balance of that. Communications is an art and science. AI is not quite there yet as far as being able to craft very compelling messaging. We talked about the emotional response and galvanizing people into action via emotion and having creative campaigns that really stick in people's heads. AI can't do that. AI, as it stands right now, is a predictive model. Large language models basically take in content and say, based on everything that I have digested, here is what I predict will happen next, as according to everything that has happened before. So it doesn't really come up with new ideas. It doesn't understand the psychology of human action and human response. So I think that there is certainly an area where AI can take over some of more of the I don't want to say grunt work, but some of the things that people have done in the past in intern and entry level positions, like in PR. I remember we used to do, you know, hit books every morning where we would make photocopies of all and printouts of all of the articles that our clients had been cited in overnight, and we would put them together and assemble them and send them over to the client. I think that those kinds of media compilations are something that's easily done by AI, and it takes that kind of grunt work out of it. But where I am a little bit cautious of where AI is concerned is that content generation. Being able to draft something and then see the reasons why your manager, your leader made those edits, not just, I don't like that word. Why don't you like that word? Why should we take out this section? I had a lower level employee who I had to coach out of a lot of filler words like, you know, this message today is to inform you that. I'm like, that's just filler phrases. And so let's take that out. This leader is much more direct and will stand up there and be like, hey, everybody, this is what's happening. So being able to coach to those things so that entry level and, people who have a couple years of experience can learn, again, why things work on a starship, that will help them get to that middle manager phase of their career in communications and continue to grow that balance of art and science. I think if you take that away and you totally outsource that to AI, two things are going to happen. One, the content will become mediocre across the board, which I think a lot of people are seeing these days anyway, because what LLMs do is take in everything, average it out to the middle, and produce that so that it's palatable for everyone. And that makes things not stand out because when everything is just palatable, it's fine, whatever. It doesn't have that intended impact. The second thing is you're destroying the lower rungs of the ladder of the career pathway for communications. And if you take that out, how are you going to be able to bring people up to that manager level where they're expected to be proficient from the get-go as far as understanding a little bit more of the psychology of how things land and why things work a certain way. So it's kind of difficult to see a future for the discipline and the function of communications if you remove those rungs from the ladder, which I'm scared of. So I would say the the nature of AI means that maybe we shift their job responsibilities and the role definitions of what those lower level folks do. And as far as learning how the sausage is made, I think it's always helpful to have. I personally have gone to a few CFOs and said, hey, can you teach me about the business? Can you teach me, what it means to calculate EBITDA and what all those other acronyms mean and what it means to the business? They have been appreciative of that because it shows curiosity on my part. But on the other hand, it also shows that I'm willing to learn and that I have that knowledge so that I can walk into those conversations and be more well-rounded and be able to comment things that are more well-informed and, less stupid questions, for lack of a better term, because I'm not going to propose something and be like, well, why don't we spend $18 billion on this initiative? Well, it's going to destroy our revenue stream. Okay.
Look, you've heard it here, folks. I hope you'll do your part to spread the message. That's all the time that we have for today. I want to give an enormous thanks to you, Keith, for joining me. It's been so lovely to have you.
It's been great to be here, Tan. Thanks for having me on.